Okay, now we have a really exciting area that's trigger management. Let's see what the professor has to introduce for us.
You know the boiling point of water is 212 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Well, it is also true if you change the chemical makeup of the water by adding salt, you could boil water faster. You have a boiling point too. Something happens and kicks off a chemical reaction in your nervous system which creates a strong emotion that can take you to crazy town, totally out of control. Listen, I have a formula to change your chemical makeup and change your boiling point. Exciting discovery, don't you think?
It is very exciting, Professor. That's trigger management. That's the way that we can control our boiling point. So let's have a look at what we mean by that boiling point. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Three Stooges as they do their vaudeville. This is a vaudeville skit about Niagara Falls. And what happens is that Mo, whenever anybody says Niagara Falls, he had such an incredible, intense experience when he was at Niagara Falls that it turns him sort of into a crazy guy where he's not even aware of what his actions are. So just the one word, when one of them says, "Oh, I remember Niagara Falls," then Mo turns around and he goes, "Niagara Falls, slowly I turned, step by step," and he runs after them and he actually has them, with his hands over their neck, and he's like strangling them because he's turned into just a crazy guy because of the emotional trigger that was set off. You could also kind of look at this as, as an example of Pavlov, for instance. So when they would ring the bell, they would feed Pavlov. So he was conditioned to, when the bell was rung, that he would start to salivate, right? So even if he wasn't being fed, he still had that trigger, if you want to call it, or that anchor. So what it is there was a resulting pattern of behavior. So the good news is that anything is learned can be unlearned. So that means that just because you've created these patterns of behavior, whether you're conscious of it or unconscious of it, it is a learned behavior and it can be unlearned. So to understand that better, it's the championship psychology that enables us to really show up and be able to master those triggers. And there are other stages that fall short of that championship psychology where we might still be susceptible to those triggers. For instance, if we're in a state of incongruency, then it's our beliefs are not congruent and in alignment with our intent. And so therefore, we can also have those types of triggers that are still getting to us because of our beliefs. And then also there's that self-sabotage, which is a heavy rife area that we just talked about before, which is where we definitely get controlled by our emotions. And then there's a place where we're in a little bit more of a positive state with unfulfilled desires, but we're not really reaching our full potential. It's really the championship psychology that we're after to really manage our triggers consistently and effectively. So as I said, it's championship psychology is really the true secret that will give you the ability to manage your emotional triggers. Now, some people think of it as discipline, and some people say it's habits, but I'm going to tell you that it comes back to communication. And when we look at the hierarchy of communication that you just saw earlier, it really all starts with ourself, right? And the way that we communicate with ourself as it relates to these emotional triggers. And it may also be the way and the behaviors that we have when we interact with our family or our boss or close friends or peers or our acquaintance and colleagues as we go further and further away from ourself in terms of our closeness of communication. But it still comes down to the meaning that we give things and the questions that we ask ourselves and how we manage those emotional triggers, because they can happen at any level. And these emotional triggers, they can come from environmental, they can come from situational, and they can come from different types of language. So, for instance, some people might have a trigger which is a fire alarm, for instance, because when they were young, they might have had a really traumatic experience that happened with the fire alarm. So every time a fire alarm goes off, then they have this emotional reaction that puts them right back into that moment. So it's a negative anchor. that triggers that brings them emotionally right back into that moment, and they can't control it. It actually fires off. It's like when you put a record player on and it plays a particular song. It's gonna, every time you put it into place one, it's gonna play that song. And so that's what happens. It's just a pattern of behavior that people are really not understanding and not able to control. So let's look at the anatomy of a trigger so that we really understand it in a little bit more detail. So position A in this tick is where the event lies. And the event in itself is really just a group of facts of what happened. And it's really, as we talked about in focus, then we give it meaning. And then it's what the meaning is that has to us. And that's where we get to position B. So as we give it meaning, we might come upon that place where we have that emotional trigger, which is position B. And then typically what happens is that after that trigger, it escalates. We go to position C in escalation, and then we go right down into crisis, right? Where we are completely out of control with our emotions. And then over time, because as time progresses, we will change and things will calm down. So we'll go into that calming down phase, and then we'll go back into recovery. So back to sort of the steady state of where we were when the event happened. And really what our goal is to get to G, which is trigger management, so that we can be at the event and we can manage that and manage those blips so that it stays even, that we're able to recognize the trigger and deal with it right away so that it doesn't affect us. And we're going to go into this in a lot more detail in the boot camp, but we want to give you an overall view to understand what these triggers are and then understand the stages here, the learning stages of being able to free yourself of those triggers, of those negative triggers. And we're also going to show you how to create positive triggers so that you can use them to your advantages in situations that you can't control, that you might need that extra support. So for instance, in the beginning, you've got that effect of the trigger. And the first thing is triggers are often unconscious and we're not really aware of them. And then they just take hold of us and we're like, whoa, what happened there? So the first area is awareness, is being aware that this particular word or this particular noise or whatever it is, that particular thing is a trigger for us. So that awareness is key. Anytime we want to learn something, we have to start with awareness. So once we have those known triggers, right? Then the next stage is we have to interrupt the pattern. We have to recognize it and scratch that record so that it's not going to play. So we'll get to inconsistent control, because if we just scratch that record once, then it's not going to, it's still going to play. It may skip for a second, but it's still going to play a little bit. And it's only after we scratch and scratch and scratch and scratch that we're able to really move to the stage where we're completely in control. That's when we really get a hold of the negative emotions that are associated with that trigger, disassociate ourselves from it, and release those negative emotions so that we can be totally in control. Now, this can happen in just a moment when a trigger takes place, and we recognize it, and all of these stages go through because we have such a championship psychology. And we're going to do a lot of work in the boot camp, which is going to help you to eliminate a lot and all of those negative emotions that you've been carrying around from past events so that you can free up a number of triggers. But we want you to have this framework and understand this so that when new triggers are created, because they will, because it's just part of life, that you can recognize them right away and that you can scratch those records and interrupt those patterns, disassociate yourself, and free yourself of those negative emotions all on your own. And you're going to be able to help others. By knowing this and knowing how to do it, you're going to be able to help others, which is truly a gift. So I come back to the statement, the quality of your life is directly related to the quality of your communication. It is so true, and it is the key to gaining control of your triggers and managing your triggers effectively. We look forward to seeing you at the boot camp.